Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt, in session. Today, I'm looking forward to speaking with Dr. Kate Watson, President and founder of the Advocacy Academy. Kate is a public speaker, author, and podcaster from Philadelphia in the US. She has presented and trained all around the US and all around the world. Her areas of expertise lie in healthcare, education, social services, and in particular, victim advocacy. Her podcast is called Only Trying to Help, and she's recently published a book by the same name. She loves coffee, donuts, cheese, and social justice. I hope you enjoy being in session with my friend, Dr. Kate Watson. Well, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt, in session, Dr. Kate Watson. It's really fun to get a chance to really sit down for a bit of time, actually, and sort of have a bit of a deeper chat about all of the wonderful work that you're doing. So thank you for putting aside some time. I think you're in the beautiful city of Philadelphia.
I am. People who live here don't call it a beautiful city. I'm so glad that you do.
Well, I've been there, as you know, once.
hmm
That
Yeah.
was where we met it, and actually, you did a sort of a compassionate action way back then. I don't know if you maybe you realized or not, but you reached out to me before the conference and a few others and sort of
Mhm.
said, for you out of towners, would you like to come over for dinner the night
Yeah.
before the conference began? I hope I expressed my gratitude enough at the time, but I did really appreciate that, and it
hmm
was lovely to have a kind of a warm sort of homely kind of welcome to this city and so we got to sit around and have a chat and really warm up for the conference. I can never remember. Is it ICME or ISME? I know there's which
Yeah.
one was it?
It's ICME, so that would be the International Conference on Motivational Interviewing. And just so the listeners for the show can get a small glimpse into the wacky world in my mind,
Yeah.
having a bunch of conference attendees come to my living room and drink with me was like a dream come true.
Well, that gives
I
us
mean,
something.
yeah, that's who I am, folks. That
Yeah.
was like, I was unbelievably excited that people from all around the world were coming to my city and were willing to take a night where you could have been running up the rocky steps at the art museum, but you came
Right.
to my house
Yeah.
instead. So
Yeah.
I was just thrilled. So thank
No, it
you for
was good
coming.
stuff. I always like to just get the conversation started to hear a little bit about you and your story, I suppose, and sort of maybe your life generally, or what
Mhm.
brought you to your work, but very keen to get a bit of a sense, in a nutshell, I guess, of some of the work you're doing. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
let's
I'd be
listen.
happy to do that. And these are always the hardest questions when you're
Yeah,
speaking to someone. Summarize your life in a few
yeah,
sentences.
yeah. And
So
you've only got a
I'll,
couple of minutes.
yeah, and it's being recorded. Um, but well, I'll just say again, Stan, thank you so much for having me. And yes, I do live in Philadelphia. These days, I never know what to call myself, Stan. I'm
Mhm.
a public speaker, trainer. I do activism and advocacy work. I think of myself as a feminist organizer, an anti violence organizer, a podcaster. So that's kind of one of my more fun projects, my more creative projects. But I'll tell you, I was thinking about it, and like the last year, my life hasn't felt like any of those things. Like
Mm.
that feels like my pre-pandemic life of traveling around and speaking to groups of people. And for the last year or so, I've really been enjoying a much slower pace of life. Um, I've been enjoying, more time for taking walks and watching old TV
Mm.
shows, and I bought a record player, and I made cheese. Who makes cheese? I made cheese.
Right.
So it's been a kind of a nice year for me. I'm very fortunate.
Yeah.
In a time when the world is really hurting, I feel like I've gotten in touch with some of the simpler things in life, and so as I describe my work, it feels a little bit like I'm giving a background of something that was, long ago. These days I listen to records and eat cheese,
Yeah.
but but yeah, I used to, travel around the world and give workshops and speaking engagements around the topic of helping skills or motivational interviewing skills, advocacy work, and I did about 100 per year. It kept me really busy, and about half of the audiences that I would speak to were people who identified as victim advocates. So they're folks who do advocacy work for those who've been exposed to violence and trauma. And I was fortunate enough to get connected to the United States military to do that in installations around the world. So
Mm.
it's been wild. And then it all kind of came to a screeching halt, and I've found this nice recovery period for myself as
Mm.
well.
Yeah.
That's a little bit about me.
Yeah. A hundred sort of dates or events per year. I mean, that's so, it's sort of mind-boggling in a way. I mean, when you look back at that from where you're at now, how did you cope, or how did you sustain that work? Because there's a lot of giving there, a lot of
Yeah.
giving to others and supporting others.
I I didn't do it well. That's just the honest truth, is that I gave too much at times, and I found myself not um not sustaining that in a way that was healthy.
Mm.
And I got to a point where I certainly knew I needed to give some things up, and I had resigned from a couple of positions and walked
Mm.
away from some projects, um and I was so scared to do it, Stan, like
Mm.
to let people down or to feel like a quitter, or and every time I was so scared to say this is too much, I need to walk away from some things, I would do it anyway and feel this enormous relief. So
Mm.
I haven't regretted any of the things that I had to ultimately let go of.
Mm.
Um, but your question was, how did I do this? And I think the
Mm.
best way to say it is not
Mm.
well until I learned that it was too much. It was
Mm.
too much.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, there was a lot of sort of drive there. There was a lot
Hmm.
of commitment to being helpful. You were sort of, and you were kind of there. Maybe there was a bit of a buzz out of all of that as well. I mean, it sounds
Yeah.
exciting in a
Yeah.
sense. So there's that drive
Hmm.
system bit, but there's also sort of that kind of really wanting to be helpful, the kind of affiliative part of you wanting to help others and that sort of thing. But isn't it funny? I always kind of think about how it actually takes a lot of courage to for self-care, to actually stop and think, what do I also need right now?
Hmm.
And up come all these other demons on the boat, as they sometimes say, the sort of but you don't really deserve it, or but you should keep helping people, or
Hmm.
like you're being selfish, or all sorts of little blockers that comes up. And it actually takes a lot of strength and courage to kind of still do it, still do the
Yeah.
self-care.
I agree. And I often think about um, eh, individual lives in the context of a culture and society's pressures. And I think that um, in a vacuum, self-care doesn't take a lot of courage. But it's in the context of a world that says you must always be productive, you must always be achieving. And some of this, I never know how much of this is US culture or how much of it is humanity in
Mm,
general. But so I should be aware of the lens that I'm seeing this through. But
mm,
I live in a country that really thrives on competition. And if
mm,
you don't do it, someone else will take it from you. And so
mm,
that is why I agree with you that it takes courage to slow down and take care of yourself, because you're up against a force that is much bigger than yourself.
Yes, it's the context, isn't it? And
Yeah.
especially the social context. I mean,
Hmm.
in some ways, it's a lot of the self-conscious emotions that get in the
Mm.
way of self-care. Whether it be
Hmm.
we feel guilty about it, or even shame.
Yeah.
How will I look? How will others judge me? How will I be held in the minds of others if I
Hmm.
slow down or don't do this? Or
Hmm.
and it does seem familiar to me here in Australia. So at least
Okay.
I think, yeah, I think
Yeah.
it certainly in Western cultures we have our version of it, but it does feel a bit like it's a sort of a human thing, doesn't it? Um,
Well, I thought so, but I wanted to put myself in check just in case it's really the world I live in. But
mm.
I thought it's at least beginning to feel like we all go through this to a degree.
Yeah,
Hmm.
the competitive motivations, the feelings of social threats, the kind of
Yeah.
living in a context where we're really having to tap a lot into drive system. It's tricky.
Hmm.
Yeah.
But I've been reading a lot about this culture of scarcity, that there's not enough to go around, so you must grab everything you can, and that causes some real, well, stress to say the least.
Mm. And it makes
Mm.
sense, sort of from that evolutionary point of view. Resources were scarce,
Mhm. Mhm.
kind of 1,000 or 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So we have that same mindset, I guess, but in it, but things have also kind of changed a little bit as well. But
Mhm.
one of the things I wanted to kind of ask you in amongst the work that you do is just this notion of advocacy.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, how do you sort of, I know it's a sort of a bit reductionistic maybe, but how might you sort of define that, or how do you think
Mhm.
of that idea of advocacy and what it is and how
Mhm.
you do it?
Believe it or not, I do think that I can boil that down to a few words.
Okay.
I've practiced that a few times over the years, but I believe that advocacy is lending your power or your voice to someone who needs it, someone or something that needs it. And so a lot of my work is with people who call themselves victim advocates, but I also work with folks who may call themselves patient advocates or policy advocates, various forms of advocacy. But the
Mm,
idea being that some people or some causes don't have enough power behind them. And so when someone comes along who does have some power or some status or some privilege, they can lend a little bit of that to someone or something that may need it so that it can be seen and heard.
mm,
And so in the case of victim advocacy, these are folks who respond to cases of sexual assault or domestic violence or even cases of hate crimes, things like that. They may accompany someone who's been victimized to an emergency room if they need an exam, accompany them to a courtroom if there is a trial happening, and really help empower this person to essentially become their own advocate, but kind of lending their own power or their own voice in the process.
I love the use of the word sort of lending. I think that
Lending.
really sort of resonates, doesn't it? You're sort of lending something that you've got to be
Hmm.
helpful to someone else who perhaps doesn't
Hmm.
have as much of that thing, whatever that
Hmm.
might be. And so the obvious kind of piece there that is really important is things like power and privilege and leverage and a voice. Those sorts of things. Some of us just through luck of the draw, really, kind
Yeah.
of might have something there, and
Hmm.
sometimes we might use it, I suppose, out of self-interest.
Hmm.
But advocacy is where we might use it really
Yeah.
in order to be helpful, to others.
Yeah. Very well said. I mean, it's using your power for good,
Mm.
rather than for harm, because you certainly could at any moment decide to use your strength or your voice to cause harm, but advocacy is choosing to use it for good.
And the sort of you said people or things, I suppose,
Yeah.
so we might be advocating for a precious old growth rainforest,
Yes.
And of
Mm-hmm.
course, that the rainforest doesn't have a voice at all.
Mm-mm.
And so to be able to lend our voice to, to
Mm-hmm.
something of nature, or even other living beings or other living
Mm-hmm.
creatures, but also to other people, and maybe there's a piece there too. I'm just sort of thinking out loud, whereby when we come together in advocacy, then it sort of multiplies the voice as well, and multiplies the power. And so sometimes, kind of advocacy is about bringing everyone together to speak up about a thing, or to in support of a person, and
Mm-hmm.
that sounds like really kind of, that's what you've been disseminating, is that sense of bringing people together to multiply the voice.
Well, yes, power in numbers. And one of the things that's been kind of a theme in advocacy, at least in victim advocacy lately, and I don't know if I love this word, but they, sort of what they call the legitimizing of the field or professionalizing of the field. We all know what a doctor is, we all know what a lawyer is, but we don't all know what an advocate is. And so there's been this push, for better and for worse, but there's been this push toward certifications for advocates, and for their, every college campus has an advocate, and every military branch has an advocate, and it's written into policy and it's very official. And there's something great about that, because it's sort of advocating for advocates, right? And there's always
Yeah.
that unintended consequence. The unintended consequence is that there have been people doing this work informally for decades who are getting kind of pushed out of the field because they don't have the degree or the certification, and they're like, well, I've been an advocate for 40 years and suddenly I'm not good enough.
Mm.
So it's I like to see this push toward more power for advocates. I wish we could find a way to not have this unintended consequence of folks being left behind.
That it's human beings are such a funny bunch.
Don't we make everything harder, Stan?
It's so funny, like because now we have, yes, a group of advocates who've been doing it, for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
feeling like they've now become sort of the voiceless because of some power differential, or
Yeah.
some rationale.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because in some ways, advocacy has something of a grassroots feeling to it as
Yeah, it's
well.
where it was born. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it sort of is. It is much more of a bottom up thing, maybe, and
Mm-hmm.
so once the powers that be come in and start to organize it and regulate it and whatever, it's good. I agree with you. We have that too, sort of, for example, advocates who work with veterans and help veterans
Yeah.
navigate, what we call the Department of Veteran Affairs, DVA. um,
Mhm.
so that would be an example of a more formalized advocacy thing. But
Yeah.
so it's good, but then it's got, it's there's always these trade-offs with humans. We do one thing with which is good, and then there's trade-offs usually. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I find that sometimes we go to extremes, right? When we decide to professionalize a field, suddenly there are 40 hoops to jump through in order to become an advocate, when maybe one hoop would have been enough, and
mm,
maybe we would have had a nice profession and still kept everybody who's been doing this since the 70s. But
mm,
maybe sometimes a good idea goes too far.
mm,
And even as I was thinking about coming to speak to you on the topic of compassion, I was sitting here jotting a few notes down to myself, and I thought, in the work that I do, I don't know that it's ever a lack of compassion that I
mm.
find is the problem. I
Okay.
I speak to groups of people who are full of compassion and this desire to relieve the suffering of others. And I find that so many of them are flailing, unsure with what to do with all this compassion. How do I put it to good use? How do
Mm,
I actually find myself helpful? Um, and
mm,
what inspires a lot of the work that I do is wanting to help people actually use all that compassion that they feel, and that desire and that drive, and like equip them with what to do with it.
so just to dive into that little bit a bit more. What is your thoughts about advocacy and compassion? What's the where is the
Yeah.
overlap? Or it sounds like you're almost saying that compassion is just sort of built in some into the advocacy or
It may be. It may
Mm,
be. I find that so I've been a victim advocate years, maybe a decade ago. I worked as a victim advocate in an
mm,
emergency room in Philadelphia, and it was my job to sit with folks who have come into the emergency room following violence in their home and be an advocate for the people who are there, unsure if they want an exam or to file a report or to call the police or any of that. And so I've been through training to become a victim advocate. And
mm,
in our training, we were constantly told, don't engage in any blaming or shaming or judging, don't give any advice, just be empowering and build rapport. And it's like, all all of those things sound lovely, but no one's teaching me how to do any of that. It's a lot of don't do this, don't do this, don't do that, and then like a vague suggestion about empowerment somehow. And it left a lot of us feeling like, well, what in the world does that even mean? And what does it look like? And I meet a lot of advocates who come to my workshops and say, I know I'm not supposed to like tell people what to do. And I know I'm not supposed to be shaming and blaming and judging, but what on earth do I do instead? And they tell me, I want to be helpful. I want to help people. I'm not exactly sure what is helpful and how would I even know? And so we talk a lot about how to help people become their own advocates so that your own compassion for them doesn't take over, that you don't end up trying to control or fix people who don't need to be controlled or fixed. They need to be more lifted up and empowered to do their own thing. And I find that sometimes this is where it feels to me like people are overflowing with compassion that they don't know how to channel. Like it's like having musical talent but no instrument to play, or wanting to cook a meal but no food to cook it with. And so I try to help people practice very practical skills for how to lend your voice, how to offer options without telling people what to do, how to, you'll know this well, ask permission before giving advice,
mm.
how to lend people vocabulary for things that they might be trying to describe themselves, um, affirmations of their own strengths. I know that you see where I'm going with this.
Yes, it's good stuff. Yeah.
I know you've heard of it before.
Compassion is kind of engagement and action. And
Mm,
so what it sounds like is that the engagement piece is thoroughly there.
yeah.
There's a real sensitivity to suffering, that there's the people are able to empathize and even and sympathize in a good way with the people they're working with, and they feel it and they feel this urge and this
Hmm.
motivation. And the tricky bit is the action end of it, like
Yeah, that's it.
what do I do to really be helpful, and what is
Hmm.
most helpful now? We want to stay away from feeling like we know what's best for people, because
Mm-mm.
that's kind of like a near enemy of compassion, isn't it? It's sort of
Hmm.
we know what's best and it looks like we're being helpful, but sometimes that can be very unhelpful. But what is it that I might do? What is it that people might really need? It takes a lot of, I don't know, just sort of wisdom and understanding or insight and
Hmm.
also, I don't know, creativity or open-minded discovery of just what that might be.
Yes, it is at times a creative act, isn't it? I like that you
Yeah.
use that word.
Mm,
And it is a vulnerable one, because if your identity is wrapped up in being this helpful person and it goes wrong somehow, so, this introduces the feeling of shame and I've
yeah.
done a bad thing and I was trying to help but it didn't go very well and what's wrong with me. And I
Mm,
find that when your professional role is helper and you feel ill-equipped to help, it's a moment of desperation for some people who I meet.
mm,
They say, I didn't know what else to do, so I just yelled at the person and said, "You need to make a police report." And it's not that they wanted to put the crime victim down or shame the crime victim. The helper was in a moment of desperation
Mm,
and felt ill-equipped and vulnerable and unsure what to do with all of that engagement that they feel. And it's like layers of compassion, because I guess I ended up feeling a lot of compassion for advocates who feel that moment of desperation and end up doing the quote wrong thing, end up sometimes causing more harm than good
mm.
by feeling so desperate to help.
The compassion motivation is there. It just gets a little bit muddied with a kind of a threat protection motivation as
Mhm.
well. That the threat
Mhm.
system's activated now, and they're worried about the
Yes.
outcome, or and they start to feel desperate about, I've got to do the right thing. And then of course we get more reactive then, I guess, and sort
Mhm.
of start to do things that might be less helpful.
Yeah, I speak to people a lot about what I call sort of an overcommitment to being, quote, good. When you're so committed to being a good advocate, it introduces this little danger zone where everything I know about myself is now wrapped up in I'm good at this. And then if you suddenly feel unskilled for a moment, even a moment, you suddenly feel unhelpful for a moment, that threat mode is certainly activated for people. And we have conversations in my trainings about, you know relaxing that commitment to be so good all the time, that you
Mm.
know opening up the possibility that you might make some mistakes may actually make you less likely to make some mistakes.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And the it really speaks to the distress tolerance piece.
Mhm.
How do we tolerate that feeling of distress in ourselves as the compassionate person that might just emerge there, as we
Mm.
start to feel that desperation to do something, or to be helpful.
I don't by any means put myself out there as an expert on things like mindfulness or embodiment or anything like that, but what little piece I offer in my trainings um, is that, in order to help yourself slow down a little bit and avoid just sort of going into this trying desperately to help, or what we call in motivational interviewing, that writing reflex. I encourage people to pay attention to their internal processes. Like, what's going on? Do you feel your heart racing? Is it suddenly really warm? Are you tapping your foot or clenching your jaw? Because if you can pay attention to those things, they seem to be early signs of distress. And the earlier that you can pick up on those signs, that your stomach's in knots or your back is all tense, perhaps the earlier you can catch yourself before you go into this kind of crossing boundaries and then trying to tell people what to do in a way that is not empowering and not really advocacy. It's quite disempowering for people. um, and so, sometimes we do an exercise where I have folks just have a conversation, and all you really have to do is pay attention to what's happening inside.
Mm. Yeah, it sort of starts a little bit in the body, or at least there's a sort of an early warning sign or system
Hmm.
there in the body. Certain little tells that, maybe threat system or fight flight or sympathetic nervous system is starting
Hmm.
to activate there. And then
Hmm.
when we have that build and grow, that might take us on a certain path. So, bring it back to the body a little bit and slow that
Yeah.
down, and activate parasympathetic nervous system, which brings us more towards affiliation, and
Hmm.
that sort of caring motivation, but calmly maybe. So there's
Yeah.
this, I can sort of imagine in some of that advocacy or victim advocacy work, that as you prepare yourself to approach the next person, whew,
Mm.
there must be a little moment there where, like, let's just roll back the shoulders, open up the chest, breathe, slow down the heart rate, just sort of slow and cool down a little bit,
Mhm.
and there's a kind of a grounding first or something.
I mean, I think best case scenario, yes. And a lot of the advocates I worked with will tell you you're just going from one person to the next, which I think is so unfortunate. I
Mm,
remember working in the emergency room and kind of playing with this idea of lending my power to people and
Mm.
almost feeling like I was a battery, and I would go meet with a patient and sort of give them a little charge that they could take some from me. But when I left, I always felt like I need to kind of power up again. And then I can go to the next room and lend a little bit of power to the next person, but I would need to step out afterwards and shake it out and ground myself and remind myself of my own safety, and that especially working in an emergency room where you're just seeing violence all around you. I had to periodically remind myself, I'm safe, I'm okay, and maybe now I can go meet with the next person.
Yeah. Yeah. The lending does deplete a little.
Yeah.
Um, and if we go back to back to back to back with lending, then
Mm,
it might deplete a lot.
mm,
And so those little moments of just recharging the battery sound really important. Finding
mhm.
that sort of strength and stability and grounding, you know, each time to sort of in readiness and steadying ourselves for the next
Yeah.
lending.
And you and I are speaking about this, Stan, as almost sort of like person to person energy, but I think this exists at kind of a political level as well. Just an example, um, when you think of celebrities who may lend their position of power to a cause, they might say, listen, a lot of people listen to me. I have a YouTube channel, or I have a, TV station, or I'm going to be on an award show tonight and people listen to me, or I've got 2 million Twitter followers. So I can lend a little bit of my power to a particular cause that is important. And sometimes doing that means some of your position gets depleted because you become controversial. You lose ad campaigns that you were going to make a lot of money from. Um,
Mm.
Maybe the most perfect example in the United States is Colin Kaepernick, the celebrity who, well, not a celebrity, athlete who was a very well known, successful football player and started using his position of power to advocate for the rights of Black people in the United States, and then
Mm.
suddenly found himself without a team to play on. So his power was depleted. And he in some ways still tries to do that recharge, but I think it's a little harder to do on that level.
Yes, it's really there's a sacrifice element
Mhm.
to it,
Mhm.
to advocacy, perhaps at the grassroots level too, but
Mhm.
certainly for those who have more or even a lot, sometimes the sacrifice can be really great.
Mhm.
In fact, I know too that around the world and where you are, people lose their lives when they
They do.
advocate, for
Mhm.
important causes or things that are really important for them. There's a
Mhm.
very altruistic element to all of that as well, isn't there?
People may lose lives, people may lose jobs, people may lose friends, but there is a sense of I have this wealth of sorts, even if it's not monetary, power, privilege, position, and I'm willing to put it at risk for someone else to borrow it for this time, even if it means I might not get it back.
Mm,
And so as we talk about um, this depletion and
mm.
how on a person to person level, it's certainly important to try to recharge when you can. I suppose it isn't always possible on some level, is it?
Yes, that,
Maybe that's a question.
yes, it's really an interesting one to percolate. This is one of the big challenges of advocacy work and compassion, in general, in a sense, is that sometimes it's lending and sometimes
Mm,
it's giving,
giving.
and it's not necessarily super easy to sort of get it back or to recharge or whatever, and
Yeah.
so we kind of have to somehow manage that or watch that or because we want to sustain it, we want
Yeah.
to keep going.
The more I think about it, the more I think advocacy is the act of lending and hoping you might be recharged, but acknowledging that you may not.
Mm.
But it's the intention is I'm lending my power, I'm lending what I have at this moment, even if it's just time or energy, I'm lending it. But the risk is there that you may not get it back. And so to make that decision consciously so that you can sustain yourself is an important part of being an advocate.
Yeah, so really there's sort of like the dilemma of action, what can I
Yeah.
do, and
Yeah.
there's a lot of wisdom and understanding and awareness and insight that we draw on, for that bit. And then
Mm,
there's the kind of the way that we can start to get a little bit threat system activated. So we really try to tap into sort of strength and groundedness, and we slow the body down to do that little bit. And
mm,
then there's this awareness that actually it can be a bit depleting to do all of this. And it takes a lot of
mm-hmm,
courage to
mm-hmm,
step in and approach, suffering or people who we're wanting to help, because we know we're lending something of ourselves, and we may get that back in other ways, or we do other things, but also it can be sort of depleting. And so,
mm-hmm.
enormous courage really and determination to kind of sort of persist with all of that. There's it's not a warm fuzzy thing, is it? uh, I mean, there's warmth in there, I suppose. There's also warmth and care and kindness, but boy, whew, like there's a lot of tough stuff to it, I suppose.
Yes, and just to give credit to some of the folks who do this work, in many cases it's also a volunteer position.
Mm,
And so nobody's becoming rich and famous on their advocacy work,
mm,
including me. um, but yes, and even the work I do with the United States military, I mean, these are folks who have full-time military positions, and they are asked to volunteer additionally to become a victim advocate so that when fellow soldiers are sexually assaulted, there's someone to answer the midnight phone call to take someone to the hospital. And so these are folks who have already decided to serve their country and potentially give their life. And now they are volunteering to carry an on call phone in case one of their fellow soldiers has hurt another fellow soldier. Just the sacrifice to me is unbelievable.
such an interesting little kind of ironic twist there, that we were talking earlier about the powers that be coming in and starting to organize the whole thing, but still expecting people to do it as a volunteer. I mean, it's
Oftentimes,
interesting.
not always,
Not all the
but
times.
in many cases, yes.
Mm,
Hmm.
mm.
Yes, it's a volunteer position that you must be certified to do.
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Again, there's some real positives there. It's also
Hmm.
just interesting, the way that it can work. So
Hmm.
what do you really love about it, or your
Mm.
work, or what are some of the sort of the wins even, that you've had with this stuff? I'm keen to hear about that too.
Well, it taps my compassionate side when I get to feel helpful.
Yeah.
So, I think personally, it's fun for me to work with different groups of people and feel confident that when I walk away, I've left something behind that they can use, that it wasn't just another workshop they had to attend. I do feel like when I part ways with different groups who I meet with, they have some tools in their toolbox. So that's fulfilling for me.
Mm,
The other thing is, many years ago, I was trained as a mental health therapist initially, and I was still in school to become a therapist when I already started to feel like this might not be the field for me.
mm,
And I considered leaving, but I actually liked school so much that I thought, well, I'll just finish and then I'll figure it out from there. So I finished my degree in psychology, and my graduate degree in psychology. And I met with an advisor and I said, I'm going to be honest with you, I just don't really think this like one-on-one therapy thing is going to be right for me in the long term. And I said, I think that I want to help more than one person at one time. And so I started exploring different things that I could do as I was considering a doctoral program. Um, and I thought, well, I could teach at a university, or I could become a trainer of sorts, a consultant. And I decided to get my doctorate degree in policy and advocacy because it was a way for me to learn about systems, like not just individual people who may struggle from time to time, but how the whole systems work. And that's been fun for me. It's been fun for me to see how every individual who may struggle with anxiety or depression, or going through divorce, or they whatever problems come up in life, they exist in the context of a whole complicated web of things. And when we can start to understand and change some of those webs, it really does help the people who are also going through everyday life stuff. And so it's been nice for me to see how some of my interests that I've always had in helping people can be implemented in a larger scale way with organizations or communities, and that's been, I think, the right path for me.
It's inspiring stuff. I mean, it really is the sort of the dissemination, there,
Yeah,
and the ability to really make this kind of broader impact. Sort of helping those who are doing the one-on-one, but really sort of
yeah,
disseminating some of these ideas. And of course, it also reminds me too that while the work can be depleting, it is also nourishing in a way.
mm,
That there is a sort of a twofold benefit to compassion, and
absolutely.
I'm sure there is to the advocacy work in that same way, that it does
Mhm.
feel fulfilling and meaningful and inspiring and satisfying and so on as well.
Yeah, and I get to be surrounded by some of the coolest people in the world. I mean, I'm very rarely in rooms of people who are groaning and saying, "When is lunch?" They're there because they really care. And so there's something so cool about that, that
Yeah.
people come to learn about these skills because they want to. Mhm.
What about your personal life with this sort of stuff? I mean, as a sort of a friend to America, and I do
Mhm.
love it over there, and I've had many wonderful experience and lots of good friends, and I sort of watch from a distance over these last little while, and I sort of um, really kind of feel for the both sides, and just the
Yeah.
sort of sense of conflict or something that seems to be coming out of there. But yeah, in your personal kind of side of your life, how does this start to spill over?
I've often thought that even just having access to the word compassion,
Mm,
even just having the vocabulary word like in my pocket,
mm,
it's, I feel it has saved me from a lot of resentment in my life. And I'm not even, I'm not even referencing some of our political turmoil right now. I mean, I could, but I don't have 5 more hours to speak to you about
right.
all that. But I mean things like when a very well-meaning family member tries to like start, well, you know what you need to do, Kate. I think it's so easy to be offended when someone thinks they know what is best for you. It's so easy to be resentful that other people are in my business or in my life. And for me, just having access to the word compassion has helped me take some deep breaths and remember that the folks who are doing this are the people who care so badly. They care so much.
Mm,
Their big hearts are actually just in the way right now. That they care to the point of maybe causing more harm than good. But it isn't all bad, is it? It isn't all bad when someone calls me to tell me what I need to do. It's annoying, but it isn't all bad. It is definitely coming from a good place. And it has helped me stay calm and relaxed in my personal relationships where I might have otherwise just been like, oh, I can't even talk to so and so right now.
mm,
And I come from a family of people who have different political beliefs, religious beliefs. And so the Thanksgiving dinner table can be stressful until we remember that we're really all sitting here trying to advocate for what's best for the world and our country. We just have very, very different ideas about how to do that.
Mm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I feel that as one embraces the word and the idea of compassion, it just opens up being able to kind of see what's behind, even the most
Mhm.
difficult behaviors from
Mhm.
others. And just that idea that actually compassion for the dark side of the human nature,
Mhm.
that's kind of where we really get to practice our compassion for things that people are doing that we don't like, or maybe
Yes.
people that we don't like, or maybe even our enemies. Like if we can bring a
Mhm.
compassionate motivation to that, not to be submissive or to
Mm-mm.
let people get away with stuff necessarily, but at least to soften the kind of the feeling there, or the anger or rage or hate.
I do agree. Um, I attend a lot of events and educational opportunities related to um, this is not going to sound like a good time when I describe it this way, Stan,
Right.
but you have to trust me that we do have fun. But they're often about violence and trauma and things that sound horribly depressing. But we
Mm,
really do have a good time at these things.
mm,
But I attend a lot of things like that. And they're often from the perspective of wanting to support victims. And then I end up, I don't know if people even pick up on it, but there's a lot of very harsh language to describe people who engage in violence. And I start to wonder, is there space to have some compassion for them as well, even
mm.
as we are advocating for those who have been hurt. um, there's a lot of hurting going on both sides of this. And I,
Mhm.
I I sometimes have the courage to say those things in those
Mm.
meetings, and sometimes I don't have the courage to advocate for those who have caused the harm.
No, it's a sort of a wicked problem, that one, isn't it? And
Mm,
I take your point, and sometimes um, we have to make a tricky call in terms of which group we feel we want to engage with in terms of advocation, I guess, which is
yeah.
it's one to really ponder, actually, isn't it? There's no
Mm,
easy answer to that one.
mm-mm.
Well, tell us about some of your current projects then. I mean, actually, in
Mm.
this pandemic sort of era, and there's kind of a lot going on with that. But as you say, things have changed a little bit for you. So, yeah, what are your current projects? And I'd definitely love to hear about the podcast as well, which you mentioned.
Hmm. Well, I mean, that would be probably my favorite thing to talk about right now. So a couple of years ago, after so many workshops where I realized just how I'm filling rooms of people who have really big hearts and want so badly to be helpful, and they're hungry for skills. I had the idea a couple of years ago that I wanted to write a book called Only Trying to Help, and talk about very basic helping skills that anybody could access. Your best friend, your next door neighbor, your boss, your doctor, your teacher, anybody could pick this book up and learn about being a helpful person. But I think I didn't initially have the courage to just write the book. I wanted to test it out a little bit first. So I approached my friend Leslie and I said, "You're kind of funny, and you have a great speaking voice. Do you want to do this with me?" And I pitched to her that we start a podcast, and the podcast was meant to be just a laboratory to test some of the ideas I had for the book. And that was really the only reason I started the podcast, was just to help me try out some material. I got
Mm.
so carried away with the podcast that the book took me forever to write, because I got into this podcast thing and it was kind of fun. And I intend to keep it going because we're having too much fun with it. So we've done we do seasons, and the seasons are short. They're only 10 episodes, but we've done 5 seasons. So we now have 50 episodes of Only Trying to Help. And we've talked about things like well-meaning advice that people might give, well-meaning humor, times when you might be making a joke trying to help someone, but they're not in the mood to laugh right now. Well-meaning compliments, maybe when you thought you were saying a nice thing to compliment a person, but didn't really land well or didn't work out. Well-meaning encouragement. We talk about the times where you think you're being helpful, kind of cheering someone on, but maybe that's not what the moment calls for. And I did ultimately finish the book. I'm just going to be shameless and hold it up right now because it's my pandemic baby. Only trying to
Oh,
help.
I do love it. It's a beautiful cover. I love the color that you chose there. The book covers are tricky, so that's great.
Well, I'll give credit to Nicole Greenberg, my graphic designer. I didn't do any of that. She did, and she's wonderful. And so yeah, the book is done, and in my mind, that was just gonna end the whole thing. But I can't let it go now. It's a part of me now. So the podcast will continue, and I'm getting started now on I don't know which one will come next, but I intend to write Only Trying to Ask for Help, a book about the ways that we sometimes seek help from others that don't really pan out. I've been interviewing people talking about how they drop hints or they give winks and nudges, and then nobody shows up for them when they need something. And I'm also working on Only Trying to Help Myself, which I think self-compassion will play a really big role in that one. Yeah.
I love that because I'm very much big on the idea of the three flows of compassion, of course. So
Mhm.
compassion for others, only trying to help; compassion from others, only trying to ask for help; and self-compassion, which is obviously only trying to help myself. I think
Only
that's a
trying to
great,
help myself.
yeah, I think that's a great bunch of books, and I love the podcast. I listen to it all the time. So yeah, congratulations on those many achievements. 5
Thank you.
seasons. Wow. 50
Thank you so
50
much. Yeah,
episodes.
it's fun to have a project that I don't want to let go of, you
There you go.
know?
Now, one of the things is I think that I do like to ask people towards the end is the 3 tips question,
Mm,
and I'm curious to hear what you might have to say because three tips that might help people on their compassionate journey, but maybe it's sort of weaving in there the sort of the advocacy idea, if you like, or but yeah,
mhm,
what would be 3 tips that you would sort
mm.
of offer to people watching?
3 tips. I would say, and I'll bet other people have said this one, so it's probably not that original.
Hmm.
But a big part of being a good advocate, or in my mind, a part of really um, sharing the compassion that we feel for others, is listening more than you speak. And I'm sure that's not original. I'm sure several people have said that on this show. But listening more than you speak is harder than it sounds. I find that people think they're good listeners, but really practicing that takes some intention and some care. So that may be one tip. Um, Another one would be to understand and embrace an element of vulnerability, because I find that it is when we feel vulnerable that we end up sometimes causing more harm than good. I spoke about that act of desperation. I just need to be helpful right now, so I'll throw everything else out the window and just tell you what you need to do. Um, and I think the third one would be learning to both assert and respect boundaries. So, you speak about the flows of compassion, Stan, and I think learning to respect the boundaries of others may lead you to a path of helpfulness for them, but asserting your own will help you with your own flow of receiving compassion.
Listening more than speaking, which I'm not sure has been mentioned before, so I think that's a goodie.
I am amazed by that, so I just invented that there.
There you go. Understanding and embracing our vulnerability,
Hmm.
and really kind of a sense of boundaries for others and for self,
Yeah.
and with good boundaries, we can kind of keep this thing going, in the
Yeah.
long term. Beautiful. So, I guess if people were to want to find you or to
Hmm.
sort of follow you or maybe even order your book,
Hmm.
how can people be in touch?
So I sort of keep some of the advocacy work a little bit separate from the only trying to help world. So if you're interested in the podcast or the book or these ideas about only trying to help for very general audiences, on social media, I use the handle I was OTTH. OTTH stands for only trying to help. So Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, you can find me at I was OTTH. And if you're more interested in the advocacy work or workshops that I lead, again, I use the social media handle Advocate, but that's Kate as in Kate, Advocate W. So instead of advocate, Advocate W, and that would be the same on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. So those are kind of the two places. I find that people either follow me one way or the other. You're welcome to follow me both ways, but I find that there's either like the OTTH audience or the advocacy audience. Choose what works for you, folks, or both if you'd like to see what I'm up to either way. But yeah, happy to stay in touch with folks.
I'll put all of that in the description on
Okay.
YouTube, and perhaps even a specific link to your book if we can, just to have that
Sure.
directly available. But well, thank you, Kate,
Thank you.
being willing to spend your Thursday evening, I
It is
think.
Thursday evening for me, yeah, and it's Friday
Friday morning.
morning. Okay, I was like, it's at least morning, but it may even be later for you.
Yeah. It's a bit mind bending, but I do really appreciate it, and I've thoroughly enjoyed just really hearing the sort of the careful way that you're thinking about this stuff and trying to sort of get your own head around it and then find ways to let people know, and it's really beautiful and wonderful work that you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Stan.
We'll see you soon.
Okay.